Roof rafters can be intimidating for newcomers in constructions or people who've just never worked with rafters. But in this video, we're going to make the process as simple as possible. By the end of this video, you'll have a thorough understanding of pitch, and you'll also know how to calculate the components of a rafter. And finally, how to cut the perfect rafter. Speaking of making perfect cuts, Woodworkers Guild of America was invaluable to me in learning the intricacies of using a circular saw and making good quality cuts, as well as maintaining and caring for my equipment. So I want to thank Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring this video. Woodworkers Guild of America is your online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information. This video on notching with a circular saw was perfect for improving my rafter cuts. I also found this video on selecting blades, which made me realize there's a lot more to it than I thought. There's also a ton of projects and great builds that help me on my honey-do list. My wife's always asking me to build new things, and fortunately Woodworkers Guild of America is always creating new premium videos to keep you coming back for more and help you stay inspired. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49, which is valid for new members only. Anyway, back to the video. Rafters were traditionally built with framing squares. Today, however, the most common tool is a rafter square, also known as a speed square. To understand rafters, we first have to understand pitch, as this is how most roofs are built in the USA. Once you understand pitch, it makes it easier to translate into structures and buildings. Now, pitch is simple. Your pitch number is quite simply a height relative to a horizontal distance. So let's say we have a 6 pitch. We have to mark 6 inches up and then lay 12 inches out at 90 degrees. Joining these two ends will give us a 6 pitch, also known as a 6/12 pitch. And just like that, by changing the height of this line, we can get whatever pitch we want. 3/12 pitch, 12/12 pitch, 8/12 pitch. It's that simple. And that is how pitch works. Your pitch is used for building your roof, and here in my attic, for example, I can take a joist or collar beam and measure 12 inches out, and our height at this point is the pitch of our roof. In this case, it's 5 inches, so we have a 5/12 pitch. If we stand outside of our home, we could see that our entire roof is simply a 5/12 pitch triangle scaled up to the size of our house. Okay. With that out of the way, let's get to designing our rafters. Here we have a small scale top plate, which is where our roof will sit. And here is where we begin to build. And the key here is to measure carefully and follow the correct steps. Now, we're not going to leave anything up to chance and no trial and error. We do, however, have quite a few steps to get started, but once we've completed this, it's smooth sailing from there on. To get our calculations correct, I've made this worksheet, which just makes the process a little bit easier. But really, all we're doing here is using a bit of fundamental math that you can scribble on any board to get your measurements. Let's visualize exactly what we're doing here and what we're calculating. Here, we have what a rafter should look like. We have the plumb cut at the top of the ridge board. Then moving down, we have our bird's mouth, which sits on our top plate. Finally, our rafter tail. And we can break this all down into a series of triangles, all of which will have the same pitch, which just means we can reuse our formulas for everything. First, we have our length from top plate to the ridge, which is our first triangle. Then our length of the bird's mouth, our second triangle. And finally, our tail overhang, which is our third and final triangle. We can see here that the next step is simple. All we have to do is figure out the measurements of all 3 of these triangles, and we'll have our template for cutting our boards. Let's use our template to work out our example here, but again, all this can be done without the worksheet. And nobody should be deterred by the math on this. It's super simple, and it could all be done with a common calculator or any smartphone. To clarify, the traditional way to do this is to join the bird's mouth cut with the rafter length. So from here up to here is a single measurement. Now on this sheet, it's been separated, though you could just join it and do 2 less calculations. Not only that, but your measurements and dimensions are exactly what you write on the paper, as opposed to joining those, your measurement, your total height will change based on how far it drops on that plate. But with that out of the way, let's get started. Here we have our small scale top plate, which is where our roof's gonna go, something like this. And using our guide here, we can see all the steps we have to take. Step 1, pretty simple, fill in the 5 values on the drawing above. What it's asking is the width of the top plate, distance between frame, the ridge thickness, the overhang, and what pitch we want. All of these values are easily calculated with our top plate. Our top plate width is 1.5 inch. We're using 2x4s, so we know that. So where it says top plate width, we have 1.5 inches. Then we have our overhang, which is whatever you decide that overhang is. In our case, we're gonna use 2.5 inches. Then our ridge thickness. In our case, we're gonna be using the same 2x4, but in your case, whatever material is used for the ridge, measure the thickness of that, and that's what goes there. In our case, it's the same 1.5 inches. And we have our frame here. That distance is from the inner measurements. So we measure the inside, and in our case, we have 18 inches. So our distance between frame is 18. The next thing is your pitch. Now you might have already decided this, or maybe not, but you have to decide what kind of pitch you want your roof to have. You could grab a framing square and kind of select what kind of angle you want for your home. Just make sure that you're on 12 inches over here, and whatever value ends up here, in this case 9 inches, that's your pitch. So you could either pick your pitch out of thin air or decide this in the design process. 9 pitch. And from here, it's just a matter of filling in all of our information. Our next step is to calculate the run, which is pretty simple. It's just the distance between frame, which is 18, minus your ridge thickness, which in our case is 1.5, divided by 2. So 18 minus 1.5 divided by 2 is 8.25. Next, we have to calculate our rise. We'll use our run, which we just calculated, which is 8.25 divided by 12 multiplied by our pitch, which is 9. So we have 8.25 divided by 12 multiplied by 9, 6.18. The next step is to calculate the hypotenuse. And this is laid out in simple terms. We have our run squared plus rise squared, which will give us our result. And then we calculate the square root of that, which will give us our hypotenuse. So our run squared, 8.25 squared, 68.06. Our rise squared, 6.1875 squared is 38.28. 38.28 plus 68.06 is 106.34. Then we just use the square root function on our calculator, and that is our result, 10.31. And as you can see here, we have an arrow pointing to our first triangle. 10.31 is the solution to our first triangle. So we have 10. We're gonna go ahead and convert the 0.31 to a fraction. So all we have to do, 0.31 times 16, 4.96, which is 5/16, and we'll leave it at that, 5/16. So our first measurement is 10 inches and 5/16. Now we have 4 steps left to do. However, if you pay attention, it's just repeating the last 2 steps in order to calculate the dimensions of the next 2 triangles. So it's just a matter of doing it just the same. So I'm gonna fill it all out real quick. And there we go, it's all solved. Now we have a couple of notes here to take into account. The first is to keep in mind that the wall plate could have some sheathing that isn't accounted for. So when measuring the thickness of your plate, there could be some sheathing that goes on later on that will change the thickness of your wall. And our other note we have here is that, as a rule of thumb, the bird's mouth should not remove more than 1/3 of the thickness of the material. There's exceptions to this and a lot of engineering that can go into removing more than 1/3 or less than 1/3, but as a rule of thumb, as long as you leave 2/3 of that material, you're good. And that is how we calculate our distances. Here we have 10 and 5/16, 1 and 7/8, and 3 and 1/8. And these are all the measurements we need to measure and cut our rafters. And as long as you measured correctly and inputted all the information correctly, this rafter will be perfect and exactly correct. And again, this sheet is completely unnecessary. You could just use it kind of to get the hang of it. But I've done these calculations many times just on a piece of board. It works perfectly fine. This is just not necessary. It's just an easier way to get a hang of the formulas, calculations you have to do. Now let's move on to actually cutting our material and getting those angles cut. Now we'll take the measurements we've calculated and cut our first rafter. The next steps are super simple. We just get our material and cut our rafters. For this, we're going to be using a framing square or a speed square. More traditionally, you'll have this 8-inch or 7-inch speed square. But in this case, I have a 12-inch just to make things a little bit more visible. Now, aside from the speed square, I've come across this little tool here. This is a little thumb screw that goes onto pretty much any square. You can put this thumb screw anywhere and then just tighten it and it stays there. And what this allows you to do is to make your angles and cuts a little bit more repeatable and more exact. So this is definitely a nice, cheap little accessory to have. So in our case, we're using a 9 pitch. So we're gonna go ahead and install our thumb screw on our 9 pitch. Here on our square, we have our common pitch, and that's what we're going to be using. We set our thumb screw here. So this is where our material will pivot. So we need to have this thumb screw on this side, and there we go. We have our thumb screw at 9 pitch. Now roof rafters are not built with 2x4s, they're built with much wider material. But in our case, we're just demonstrating with 2x4s. So taking a look at our material, we can see how we can achieve a 9 pitch, which is what we used to calculate our roof pitch. Now we have to use the 9 pitch for all of our cuts to make sure everything lines up correctly. All we do is place our square on the material and pivot it until that 9 lines up with the material. If you want to learn more about a speed square, check out this video here. So by doing this here at the 90-degree angle of our square, we have the rise of a 9 pitch. What this means is that here at this angle, it's a 9 pitch, which is what we want. So now that we have everything calculated, all we have to do is use our square with a 9 pitch and mark everything out. We'll start at the very top, mark our top, and then we'll use our tape measure to mark the first line, which is 10 and 5/16, which is right here. The next mark is 1 and 7/8. There's 1 and 7/8. And the next mark is 3 and 1/8. Down, 3 and 1/8. So there we have our 3 marks. So after marking our 3 measurements, again, we just take our speed square and make those 9 pitch marks. And we almost have our rafter. The final step is to mark our bird's mouth, which is between these 2 lines here. Your speed square will have a line crossing here, which is used to make straight lines in the middle of materials. However, the speed square is designed for thicker material, so we're going to have to use our framing square here. All we have to do is line up the square with this line and line it with the end of this. Make a mark right there. And this is our bird's mouth. The next step is to cut this out. Now, something to keep in mind here is that it's very important to keep your saw as flat as possible. A lot of the times when we're making straight cuts, we can start at an angle, straighten out, and move that. However, since we're already cutting at an angle, tipping that saw will change your pitch. So you have to make sure to keep it as flat as possible and as straight as possible when making these cuts. What I like to do is feel out the saw, make sure that I have it nice and flat. And there is our first cut, which will sit at the ridge board. The next step is to cut our bird's mouth here. When cutting the bird's mouth, your circular saw is not going to be able to go all the way through unless you go past where your cut's supposed to be. In order to finish off the bird's mouth, you could just go past where you're supposed to, or you can come back with a handsaw or a jigsaw, which is my preference. And finally, we can make our final cut at our final mark, which is going to be the length of our tail. And there we go. Just like that, we should have a perfect rafter. Now, the benefit of spending so much time on making this first rafter is that the next ones are going to be very easy as long as you get this one correct. Your next rafters are as simple as laying this one on your material, and your angles will line up perfectly here. And with all that lined up, you just mark your next rafter. And just like that, we're ready to cut our next rafter, and it should be damn near perfect. Now off camera, I have cut a second one. Let's try this on our scale top plate. We'll place this board here in the middle to give us our ridge dimensions. And moment of truth, is this going to fit properly? And that is perfect. There we go. We have two perfect rafters. So at a much larger scale, this is going to be perfect. And taking a look at our dimensions, we are spot on. Here we have exactly 2.5 inches. Following this formula, whether you scribble it on a piece of wood or do use this worksheet, there's no mistakes, no guessing whether it's going to fit or not. It just works. And just like that, you can cut the perfect rafters. As long as you measure correctly, this will work every single time. If you're interested in the worksheet, it's linked down below. And none of the tools in this video were sponsored, but if you're interested in any of them, there's links down below that support the channel and help us continue to make this content.